Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, hosted by Igor Schwartzman and me, Johannes Kleske. Follow the Rabbit is a podcast where we decode cultural phenomena to help you update your mental models of the world. And today we have an episode for the fellow media nerds among you. We have Adrian Monck as our guest. And if you don't know who Adrian Monck is, I'm going to take a moment to familiarize you with his career of more than 40 years in journalism, publishing, and much more. So he started in the late 80s and early 90s with broadcast journalism at the likes of CBS News and ITN. He covered most of the major global events in that time, like the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Gulf War. Then in 2005, he became the professor and head of journalism at the City University of London. So he switched to an academic career focusing on training the next generation. And then he switched again in 2009 when he became managing director of the World Economic Forum. And before he showed up there, that was a very secretive event, very closed down. And he turned it into what some refer to as like a global powerhouse of communication, doing a lot more publishing and trying out a lot of new digital formats for that. He also made sure to bring more diverse voices on stage at Davos. And so after 14 years there, he switched again and left the World Economic Forum and became an independent journalist, focusing on his newsletter, 7 Things, releasing an issue every week, covering all kinds of topics of geopolitics, technology, culture, with a very typical witty and wry sort of style. And it was fascinating for Igor and me how he has been on the forefront of all of these transformations in journalism and media over the last decades, but always being a bit earlier than the rest and just approaching from a very intuitive point of view, just feeling his way forwards. So we talk with him about his newsletter, the challenges with that, how it is to publish on a platform like LinkedIn, all the pros and cons that come with that. But in the end, it's really a conversation about curiosity, how the newsletter is his outlet, how he can make sure he keeps reading, he keeps discovering new things, he's keep changing perspectives and point of views. And that, to be honest, was quite inspiring for, I think, Igor and me, how we want to approach our work and keep being curious about the world and discovering new approaches to it. Without much further ado, as always, you can reach us via ftr@knownoutlets.xyz. We really enjoy your feedback, your questions, your suggestions. Here's Adrian Monck.
Hello, back to Follow the Rabbit. Johannes and I are joined today by Adrian Monck, who is, among many things, also the author of a very, very big newsletter, 7 Things. Some of you might have followed it for quite a while. Besides publishing a media empire on his own, he's also working sometimes for the World Economic Forum. And before that, he also has a journalistic background. So we are super happy to have him on Follow the Rabbit to discuss how is it to run a publishing empire all by your own.
That's a very good question. I mean, I'll tell you what, I pay myself nothing. So I'm the cheapest employee I've ever had. And also I have to give myself permission to go on holiday. So, that's kind of a negotiation with myself. So it's a kind of a strange one having this thing. It sort of grew. I've done it nearly 5 years now. So I'm coming up on edition 250. And it sort of grew out of doing it with the forum, but under my own name, because back then LinkedIn said, and it's got about 160,000 plus subscribers. LinkedIn said, you've got to do it under your own brand. You can't do it under an organization. So I thought, okay, whatever, I'll get going on it. And a very nice colleague encouraged me to do it, I think partly to kind of get me off his back. And I built one email newsletter, which was the forums one, which ended up going to nearly 1 million subscribers. And that was very simple. And I stole that from Quartz and I just rolled out the Quartz. That was easy. Building one on LinkedIn was a little bit harder, not quite so straightforward.
So, I mean, with platforms, it's often that they're bringing features that are otherwise very hard to kind of build for yourself, but they also come with limitations. And what's basically what you're saying, a certain limitation really got you to publish under your own name.
Yeah, it did exactly that, right? And then when I left the forum, I kept going with it because I figured, you know what, it's a nice discipline. It kind of keeps me engaged in the world. It's fun to do. It's a nice audience, and I kept doing it, and I've kept on doing it for 2 years. So, and it still gets interesting comments and traction. So it's fun to do.
So just a question about like how do you do it? Like, do you write throughout the week and then put everything together and publish, or do you just okay, the deadline is in 3 hours, I better sit down now and write the damn thing? Like, what's the process here?
Yeah, a little bit of both, really. I mean, it depends. There's times when if I have more time to think about it, then obviously, I can fill that time with kind of endlessly going through stuff. But I've also been in the business long enough to know that if you write something 7 days beforehand, it's going to feel really stale and nasty by the time you publish it. So I
I
know.
imagine that's the case this week.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think I've taken notes on 2 stories I want to do for this week, and I'm waiting on whatever else happens because frankly, how can you talk about geopol when you've no idea what's coming down the pipeline? And there's a couple of angles that you can look at on stories as well that are useful and interesting for people. I mean, I think, what I've realized is, I don't realize it, I know it, is I can't compete with big media organizations, but what I can do is kind of find little bits and pieces of sidebars that might be interesting enough to people to help them kind of get a handle on stuff, And sometimes I'm early with it, So I was talking quite a long while back before the FT and other people about Stephen Mirren's note from Hudson Bay Capital about the Trump administration. And, I've surfaced a few other things over time, the Arctic stuff that they were talking about as well, which is just because I read too much, so it helps to kind of have a little steam valve outlet in the newsletter.
It really feels like just quickly. It really feels like newsletters have been like. So I think that before that it was blogs where it was for people who read too much, like you said. Just like I'm doing it for the blog, so everything is allowed. I actually have to read even more. And now it feels like newsletters have replaced that. It's just like the excuse to. No, honey, I have to read more. It's the newsletter. I have to issue and bring out another issue.
Yeah, my wife would, smash my laptop over my head if she heard me talking about it. But yeah, it's a nice excuse, and look, it's a nice for an old journalist like me. It's a lovely way to spend time thinking about the news and thinking about adding a bit of value to it, and also bringing 40 years of kind of grumpy journalistic experience to bear on what's going on because. I've taught journalism. I've been a journalism professor. I've been an editor. I've run newsrooms, run news organizations, and also I've spent time at the forum looking behind the scenes and being with world leaders and CEOs and kind of knowing what goes on in those rooms. So bringing that to bear on a newsletter is fun. It's not always kind of, sometimes I wish I call it 7 Things is the newsletter's name. I wish I called it 3 Things some weeks, let myself off the hook, but it's a discipline. And I think one of the key things for all of this when you're talking about building something up is it's got to be something you enjoy if you're not getting paid for it, and it's got to be something you can repeat. And this is something I feel like I can repeat. I've done my bit on, and it's not too much trouble. It's annoying. If I haven't finished it by Wednesday evening, I'm going to stay up late on Wednesday night. But I know I can get it out every Thursday lunchtime, and that's my little goal. Which makes me feel good on Thursday at about 1:00.
Yeah, I mean, this format really is kind of similar in that way because we're not getting paid for doing this podcast. And if you would have asked me a year ago if we can manage to pull off every week an episode, I would have said you're probably crazy. But then you kind of get into it, and again, it needs to be like as you said, it needs to be a little bit annoying. Like you need to kind of work for it. But that satisfaction of publishing it on a specific day is actually really fun. What I'm like from the way you're describing it, I think you're allowing yourself really to be the kind of journalist that you enjoy most without having an editor or having like an organization to talk to that maybe prevents a story as too fringe to who is going to be interested in that. But it
Yeah.
turns out, and I think that's kind of like what's coming through also in like reading your newsletter for quite a while is it what is happening in the world right now is that the weird things are interesting to quite many people. And I think that's kind of an ability of your newsletter and others to kind of sidestep what a classic kind of journalistic organization can't really do because it needs to debate with with itself really whether or not this makes sense for their audience or not.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an incredibly kind of liberating thing about not really having to kind of try too hard because, you really don't know what's going to hit or miss some weeks. I mean, there's weeks when I press publish and I'm like, oh, that was terrible. And it's super successful. And there's weeks when I'm like, I love that story. That's so good. And people are like, meh. And you don't know. And that's the great thing about publishing, right? Is like, you don't know what's going on in the brains of the people who are listening, reading, hearing you. And I think that for news organizations, you can spend a lot of time, less so these days, but back in the day when it was gatekeeping, it was all about, let's get inside the heads of the audience. Let's do this, let's do that. And it was frankly pretty BS, right? Because it wasn't based on analytics. It was all based on kind of hunches and gut feelings and intuition and a bit of,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I can totally relate whenever I publish my own newsletter or publish an episode here, and I'm super excited about it. And then it's kind of like people are like, "Well, yeah, nice," and move on. And you're like, "But I put so much heart into it." So I guess my question is, after 5 years of doing it, do you still do you look at analytics and kind of try to understand what is happening? Are you or are you just letting yourself kind of
So
do
I
the
have
thing?
a rough idea, and and the rough idea is that LinkedIn don't really love newsletters anymore, right? They don't promote them. They promote
Interesting.
video. So it kind of stumble bums along, but it's been at about 160,000, 165,000 for 2 years. Yeah. So it's not, the algorithm is not pushing it to people. And actually I know now as well, when the notifications go through, sometimes it doesn't go to people. And I also know that when you write about some things, like back in the day, if I'd write about, say, a QAnon thing, when QAnon was doing a lot of disinformation, LinkedIn's, very dumb blocker blocks you for writing about QAnon. So if you publish an article from a Cambridge professor or you argue about something quite highbrow about QAnon, it's just going to not share anything that you've done with anyone. So you kind of learn the insides and outsides of what is making the algorithm tick, or it's what's making LinkedIn tick as a platform. I've started this year, I think, to try and take it a bit more seriously and give myself a bit more freedom. One thing I've done is I've taken all the links out of the newsletter, which I really hate because I loved giving people links because I'm a natural reader and I use it as my kind of, sharing mechanism. But the links in the newsletter killed it. So it literally gets double the engagement without the links, which is heartbreaking, isn't it? Heartbreaking. Substack is not like that. And so on Substack, I've started doing Substack now, and I do links on Substack to support the Substack thing, to give it some oomph. It's now got like 650 plus 670 subscribers on Substack, and it's free. But I started posting on Threads and Bluesky, and very counterintuitively on Threads now, I think from zero, I'm about 5,500 followers. And on Bluesky, I'm like plodding along at 1.3 thousand followers, posting pretty much the same stuff, right? And people always say, oh, Bluesky's so much better on engagement. I think I jumped on a bit late. I didn't get any referrals from packs. I got a couple of pack referrals, but it's, the old rule of starting stuff is start early on new platforms. I started early on the LinkedIn platform with newsletters. I should have started with doing video, but I haven't because I hate video, I hate myself. And so I can't bring myself to do it, but people tell me I ought to go out and do something. So this year I'm going to try and get over my intense self-loathing and do something on video. Having been a TV producer, it gives you a very funny feeling about being in front of camera. I like putting people in front of cameras. I don't like being in front of a camera. So, so I suppose one of the things touched on there is you've got to get in early, right? That's the trick.
Yeah, I mean that's the rule. That's the general rule of platforms, and I think like what you're describing is also the benefits and the problems of any platform really, because you're like no matter how big your newsletter or how big your reach is, you're still kind of depending on their good graces in a sense, and LinkedIn obviously doesn't want people to kind of step away and kind of actually read the article. They want the engagement to stay on the platform. And that's why um, they're rewarding kind of like you removing the links. And I think there is obviously some worry in that sense that Substack can get to a similar place where Substack becomes kind of synonymous with newsletters, and um, it will kind of like, I mean, we don't even have to get into the problematic content filtering problem that they already have. I guess that's a good kind of segue also to talking about this idea of, you have seen different versions of the web, the social web come and go. We're now kind of going into this phase where platforms still very, very dominant, but at the same time, it feels like people are less likely, like we're using them, but reluctantly. And my question would be, where do you see like audiences develop? How much sway do audiences have over the people who are producing the kind of content that they're reading, as to how this will evolve over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think, I wish I could predict the future on those kind of things, and I'd be cashing in my chips. But we're obviously moving in a much, much more video direction, and you can see the way that's gone, right? With the YouTubeization of everything, the sort of talk radioization of things. But I think you can also see the dangers of that, right? If you look at someone like the horror story that is Russell Brand, dreadful.
Some of them are here too.
Occasionally, I hear that German politics isn't all rock and roll and excitement and heavy metal, but he started off doing that, and then he realized that no one was going with him. And a little bit like sort of Joe Rogan with sports and everything, you can take off and discover that the audience will follow you down the proverbial rabbit hole if you want to go. If I suddenly wanted to start writing conspiracy theories on my newsletter, I might get more traction, right? People might like it more. And if I started being more outspoken, I definitely see it on my socials, is the more kind of pushy, outspoken stuff gets more clicks. But I don't want to be that person, and I don't need to be that person. So for me, I have a kind of restraining order on myself, which is that I don't have the financial kind of requirement and the living, which is lucky for me, right? I'm a 60-year-old guy, to have to make a living doing this. So I can stay sensible. But there's a lot of people out there who are not under those kind of restrictions, who want to get the audience and will do whatever it takes. And, that's kind of depressing. And I think you can see it with some of the TikTok stuff and some of the other stuff, is you see people who start out in one vein and you think, oh, they're kind of cool. Noah Smith, one of my favorite writers about 5 or 10 years ago, lovely ingenue guy, always kind of questioning himself. And then finally, like Noah has seen the direction that he has to travel in. You know, he gets a job at Bloomberg Opinion where he's not really very happy. And then he goes off into where he is now, which is writing these odd pieces like, what was it? World War III is going to break out this year or something, or, you know, and it's kind of, don't do that, Noah. Don't do that. And that's, I think, the tension you always have. I mean, you can see it in the Daily Mail, which, you know, busts through that wall every day in the UK and is incredibly successful. You know, it doesn't have a restraining order on itself. It will go there, you know, and no one's going to hold it responsible, right? But I like to think, you know, there's still a world where you can be boring and you know, keep yourself in line and get an audience.
I mean, the interesting part for me is that we're talking about this as if this behavior is new, but one of my favorite movies of all time is Network from 1976,
Peter Finn.
and it basically discusses the same. And the question, I guess, to that end is, we're getting more and more fragmented. In a sense, you know, we are in a way contributing to the fragmentation because we have a podcast, we have a newsletter, and we're trying, whether or not sensibly or not, we're still trying to get people's attention because why do it otherwise, right? And so I think the interesting kind of thing where we all are right now is that we are dependent on those platforms, and we do need some form of um, way to connect to other people. But at the same time, we are also contributing somehow to the fragmentation and the landscape in which we find ourselves in, seeking for meaning and so forth. And I think that what you described as boring, I guess, is for other people a recognizable kind of quality that they are seeking in a space that is full of people who are predicting a lot of things and not necessarily looking for actual answers. Would you say?
I mean, I hope so. You know, I mean, you're right about a lot of these arguments. They're super old, right? I mean, I was a historian of journalism for a long time, and you know, you look at the antecedents of journalism, and you know, they're not really in newspapers at all. You know, I mean, Hegel, I think it was, said, you know, reading the newspaper has replaced your daily prayers. You know, and before that, you know, the people who you have most in common with these days are preachers, right? I mean, the Bonfire of the Vanities, Savonarola in Florence in 14. You know, this is kind of what we're going through now, right? And this is a kind of religious backed sort of metaphor for today's society. You know, Florentines would be very familiar with Donald Trump, you know, and the kind of language he speaks. I mean, all of that, you know, gives you kind of a richness and a context to today's media debate. It doesn't really help us, I often feel, because I feel like we haven't moved on very far. You know, we're still able to have these conversations that, you know, Machiavelli could have, or, you know, Socrates could have about information. And that doesn't suggest to me that whilst, you know, many aspects of human life have changed for the better and technology has changed, a lot of the kind of tropes that we operate on, the kind of, you know, the heuristics, if you like, these haven't progressed very far. You know, we've just gotten, you know, found ourselves in different loops when it comes to talking about things like media and stuff, and politics too. But maybe I'm getting a little too, you know, going down my own rabbit hole on that one.
Yeah. So what I really find interesting, because you talked about tensions and finding a balance, and with you coming from the world of Davos and the World Economic Forum and having a like large media publishing business there, and then taking, I'm guessing, a lot of those from the audience with you for your newsletter. But then, if my research is correct, you also can be quite critical of like a performative globalism kind of thing, which I think is it's an interesting aspect of having an audience, but also taking the liberty to not completely just cater to it and like, here's what you want to hear, and I'm telling you what you want to hear. I'm also telling you the stuff
that maybe you don't want to hear or that you're not so fond of hearing, which I think in a lot of sense is actually something that is so rare these days that people actually have an urge for that. So to like an honest conversation, is it something that comes natural to you, or is it something that you think a lot about, like your tone of voice and where you put your finger and say, oh, this is actually a problem?
I mean, I think it's very easy to be critical. And I think the one thing I've learned getting old is how easy it is to call people out the truth is, I've been in journalism long enough to know that I've done bad things. I've been weak. I've taken the easy way out. I've done all the things I think you shouldn't do. I mean, that's life, right? You don't get to 60 without doing those things unless you're, a candidate for the papacy or something, which sadly not going to happen for me, at least with my kids. And when I do kind of push on things, I try and get my head into other people's heads on some of that stuff. Some of the most interesting commentary I find is there's guys who report on China. There's a guy called Zixin Wang who's pretty well known. I've followed him for a long time and kind of championed his stuff along with quite a few other people. And what he does is he goes through Communist Party pronouncements, really boring ones, and he tells you what they mean. He basically, in the same way that, you might look at a law as a lawyer and say, this is what the law means, right? He does the same thing for them. And yes, he's a CCP journalist. He's a kind of whatever, but he performs a really useful function through his journalism. And he's, and he represents an interesting voice on China. Now, there's Hugh Jin, who I've mangled his name, but he used to run the Global Times. He's not a very thoughtful voice. He's a kind of wolf warrior-y, grumpy old man of kind of a sort of Daily Mail. But, once you get your head into the fact that the ecosystem of China is 1.4 billion people, that they're very different, that there are incredible fissures, fractures, interest groups in that society, which you have no idea about, and I have no idea about even. Once you can kind of absorb that, then you can stop doing the kind of crass commentary that you get so often in international affairs, which is this means this and this means that, where it's like Donald Trump is thinking this. I know what Donald Trump is thinking. He's bearing the last imprint of the last person around him who he likes, who spoke to him. You can see that, right? But does that mean someone like Scott Bessent is sent out to speak to cameras when he hasn't been briefed, doesn't know what he's talking about? Look at the Signal chat with JD Vance and Mike Waltz. You can see these people in real time, what they're doing, how they're taking decisions, what the inputs are on them. It's not very edifying, but it's also not super complicated, right? And I think this is what the sensibility I try to bring to thinking about things, which is to say, more often than not, there's more conspiracies out there. There's more cock-ups out there, I should say, than conspiracies. Secondly, there are some genuinely bad people doing genuinely bad things. Thirdly, they don't always join up, and trying to give people that understanding that, like, that's the overall message, I think, from 40 years in journalism, which is incoherence. The world is not coherent. And I wish it were. I went into journalism from a small town. I grew up in a council house, which is like a, sponsored housing. I don't know what you call it, social housing in a very poor, very crappy part of England. I was the only one of my siblings to go to university, and I kind of escaped. And I wanted to understand why my family lived where they lived and why life there was crappy. And that was my journey into journalism. And I've spent the whole rest of my life trying to figure out how to make sense of it all. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But, that doesn't mean you shouldn't stop trying, right? I think that's the kind of key thing.
No, it doesn't. But at the same time, we do face currently, especially with the, internet at hand and how it works and which kind of behaviors it also amplifies, while also making it harder to kind of cater to that behavior that maybe facilitates a more critical thinking. I mean, just the example of removing links amps up reach. It kind of provides you some context into how this works. And to a certain extent, I mean, this podcast is called Follow the Rabbit. There are plenty of, QAnon adjacent kind of language where it's like research your own truth. People are going down rabbit holes. And so, I mean, I find myself almost like not asking any question, but more like a statement. What I do find interesting, though, is that every passing year we kind of like we haven't been doing this quite as long as you do, but we've been doing kind of like watching the media and kind of watching media evolve over the last 15, 20 years. It's kind of interesting that we find even more niches that becoming the actual reality for some people. And so it is far harder now to kind of establish common understanding around things, because it's far easier to create narratives that even if you present a signal chat to the world, people can still step in front of the camera and say that there were no kind of like information shared that is critical to the security of military personnel. I think that's what baffles me in that ability of us humans in a way to suspend our disbelief and kind of focus on the one thing that we want to focus on.
I guess. I mean, look, the thing that struck me about that whole conversation is the facile and kind of flipped way these men, I think they're mostly men, were talking about killing people, and we know from the Houthi reports that apparently there were, men and there were women and children who were casualties of those attacks, which is not what we expect, or used to expect, I should say, of attacks undertaken by, Western militaries. And at one moment they talk about a guy going into his girlfriend's house and they blow him up with presumably the girlfriend and her family and everyone else who was in the neighborhood.
And it's just an emoji, and it's now
this, by the way, is not talked about. Instead, we hear about the security risk to US personnel, of whom, I'm going to be honest here, I don't think there was a huge security risk to them from the Houthis in that particular occasion. They're not sophisticated enough to hit back. But, those kind of things bother me.
Yeah.
And the fact that the discussion is framed in those ways, that bothers me. And, there are things I don't talk about because I cannot wade through the kind of rage and the disappointment to speak about them. And, you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. There are parts of the world where I've reported from and I feel like, I'm pretty well aware of what goes on in conflicts. I've been to many of them in the course of my journalistic career and since, but there are times when you simply cannot wade into an argument, or you cannot add a useful perspective. And I think, and I know that in the Middle East, that's pretty true, I feel, at least as far as I'm concerned. And not because I don't know lots and lots of people in the region and have been to almost every single part of it over many years. I have. But, that's just what, it's not somewhere I think I can make a contribution. So I kind of tend to keep away from it as a rule.
I find it interesting that the like the approach to journalism you just described, and what I find so interesting is that you, from everything I hear from you, it was like more like intuition, how you got to start your own newsletter because you saw it work really well in a different context. And by this, like being just maybe 1 or 2 years ahead of a curve where a lot of journalists would quit their media companies, tempted by money from Substack, or just seeing that it would provide them with a more like editorial freedom that they were looking for. Like in the last 5 years, that seems to be like a way a lot of journalists have moved, like the re-emergence of newsletters as this like super important part of our media diet. And we're definitely not asking you for any predictions, but just from your intuition, how do you see that evolving? You talked already about video as one part of that. Do you think, is there, so for example, like one example is that more like individual newsletter publishers are like coming together again, forming a bundle to say, oh, we actually makes sense to have like a combined offering. Anything for you on your horizon where you say, no, that might be an interesting way where this is moving?
So, I'm going to be maybe a bit depressing, but maybe not so depressing. I don't know. It depends how you feel about these things. If the biggest performer, one of the biggest performance activities of the 19th century which is a huge deal and made a lot of money for people, was touring poetry. You know, poets used to go and tour and give performances and, you know, have readings and everything. And, you know, some of these poems, you know, if you read British poetry of the 19th century, I mean, it goes on so long. You're like, it must have been a 3-hour performance or something. I don't think I could sit through all of that. And I think a lot of written media is going to go in the same direction. You know, it's going to become like poetry. People will do it because they enjoy it, and they will or will not need an audience, and they will have other jobs. You know, one of the most famous British poets of the 20th century, well, two of them, you know, W.H. Auden, who I love, Philip Larkin. Larkin was a great poet. His day job was the librarian at the University of Hull in the north of England. You know, Auden got a job teaching creative writing, you know, in the US to kind of pay the bills, right? Neither of them could make money out of poetry, even doing readings. So I think in journalism terms, a lot of newslettery type substance is going to go in that direction. And you can already kind of see the way things are going. You know, when I was a professor, I started a lot of journalism courses, but I also felt pretty guilty about bringing people into a place where, you know, the salary and the prospects were not terrific. But what I did think was, if you upskill people, they can become very employable. And, you know, some of the great young journalists who I helped train, I mean, one of them is the brilliant John Byrne Murdoch. I'd love to say I played a great part. I designed the program that he did. You know, he writes for the Financial Times, but people who are his peers work, you know, doing selective reporting for hedge funds, doing due diligence, doing, you know, using the tools they gathered to do this kind of work, which you never read about, right? You never hear about that stuff, you know, because someone's paying quite a lot of money for it, but it's not going into the public domain. And that's another reason why I like writing. And I think it's kind of useful to write, because a lot of the people who have my kind of background, I do some of this myself, you know, that you consult to people, you give people an insight into what people are thinking about and what's going on. But one of the things I used to want when I was a kid growing up was I wanted someone to tell me what it was like. And that's what I try and do in the newsletter a little bit with some stuff, is try and put some of the pieces together and say, that's kind of my best guess on where this thing is at, or this is something you should think about and be interested in, because I'm lucky enough now at this stage in my life to meet a lot of interesting people, you know.
Well, I mean, it kind of, I mean, this conversation reminds me of this question that I kind of carry with me for quite a while. And it's like, the journalism or the media is the fourth estate, but it's the only one that actually requires a business model. And it's kind of interesting that, I mean, basically what you're saying, it already becoming kind of like just a hobby, exaggerating. But it's like the thing, it's not a hobby, it's a passion, but it's not the one that you're making money. I
Yeah.
think we do definitely not expect, you know, this conversation to solve an age-old problem, but it is kind of an interesting signal hearing from you how you see this happening and how it's unfolded. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about this. Maybe we didn't really do this before, but maybe, oh, Johannes.
Yeah, so you said solving age-old problems. So I have to ask you, how do you decide what you read? Do you have your 50 newsletters that you read for 2 hours in the morning? Do you just read whatever comes up and you just jump at it in a flow? How do you decide
I
what
was
to
about
read
to,
in a world that is...
So I'm an obsessive, you know, I used to be a Google Reader person, you know, and an RSS person. And so
yeah.
I still have my Feedly subscription with tons and tons of searches set up and tons of subscriptions. And I have a ton of subscriptions. That's one of my failures. But also I follow tons and tons of lists on everything from X to Bluesky to Threads and other things, right? So I'm usually across all those different platforms looking and reading. And because I kind of grew up reading wires, it doesn't feel odd to me to get stuff like that. And it doesn't feel odd to me to stop for a minute and check. And also I'm pretty aware of when something reaches a critical point where I need to kind of pay more attention to it. And I think those are my little mental heuristics of how I kind of go about thinking about what it is that I look at. I mean, one of the things I'm looking at this week is radio frequency powered devices, right? Because I was talking to a couple of Israeli guys a few months ago who are brilliant innovators, and they are designing chips that just run on mobile phone signals. And you imagine you can put them anywhere, right? And so this technology is getting to a critical point where, we could start to see a lot of things that don't require the little lithium ion batteries, which is both pretty cool and also pretty scary. You can imagine the whole, you become a mass of devices, right, that kind of do or don't talk to each other. But still kind of scary, interesting, fascinating. That's the kind of thing that I think, it's time to kind of look at that now and go a bit deeper on it, and that, and so that might or might not, depending on the economy still being able to support the creation of those kind of devices in the future, and not us kind of, chipping away at small stones. That will be that'll probably be in this week's.
Definitely. As an anecdote, things started becoming a little bit more, sassy in Germany. I started exploring where I could move to, and I talked. I kind of did the chat with Claude, and it recommended me Taiwan, and I was like, I'm not sure about that. So I think getting a lot of things is not necessarily as straightforward as we used to think about it. But that connects a little, like my questions that I was going to ask is, we don't usually ask that, but I think it's actually a nice thing that we can steal from Ezra Klein. What are 3 newsletters that you would recommend reading that you think are doing a great job?
I would say, they're probably a little Chinese focused because I find China absolutely fascinating. But I love Sinica, which is Kaiser Kuo's. Kaiser and I worked together at the forum. Brilliant guy, Chinese heavy rocker. And he curates this incredible mix of China news. I think it's fabulous. And it's a real kind of, a real mixture. And he brings a really smart sensibility to it. Zichen Wang's Peakingnology. Again, it's a little punishing as a read because he does it very formally, but it's a fabulous insight into, 1.4 billion people and their governance and what makes that country tick, and he is a smart guy and he does a really high quality job of curating that. And then I guess I'm not an Ezra Klein reader, but I do like, Adam Tooze's chart book, and I'm on the Center for Global Thought at Columbia University, so I get a chance to kind of go around cheerlead for him. But I don't know if that counts as advertising, although. But I love chart book. I love what Tooze has done with it. I think he's very smart in kind of putting stuff together in a really interesting way. And if I was as clever as he was, I wish I could do that.
Nice. Thank you so much, Adrian. You had a long flight behind you, so we'll get you to some rest. We appreciate your time, and thanks for sharing insights and stories.
Thank you both. Really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.